Non è facile, no? Presentare professori così conosciuti internazionalmente, perché hanno un curriculum, insomma, importante, però diremo quelle cose forse più significative. E ho visto che il professor Attridge ha studiato al Boston College, alla Cambridge University, alla Hebrew University of Jerusalem e ha fatto il dottorato alla Harvard University. Anche poi è stato ed è professore alla Yale Divinity School, dove è stato decano dal 2002 al 2012. Lui è, voi lo sapete meglio di me, è molto conosciuto nel campo degli studi del Nuovo Testamento, soprattutto sulla lettera agli ebrei. Io quando pensavo agli ebrei sempre mi venivano questi nomi, Attridge e poi il padre Vanois, perché era quello che io l'avevo avuto qui come professore. Quindi è molto famosa la sua opera Essays on John and Hebrews, a commentary on the Epistle to the Hebrews, first century cynicism in the epistles of Heraclitus, the interpretation of biblical history in the Antiquitates Judaici of Flavius Josephus, and so on. Poi, a parte, diciamo, dei libri che lui ha scritto, ha editato ben 12 libri e numerosissimi articoli che è impossibile di citare. Ma poi ha anche svolto, diciamo, delle cariche importanti, come essere membro del consiglio di redazione della Catholic Biblical Quarterly, Harvard Theological Review, Journal of Biblical Literature, Novum Testamentum e la serie dei commentari di Ermeneia. Anche è stato membro attivo della Society of Biblical Literature, è stato presidente anche nel 2001 di questa Society e anche presidente della Catholic Biblical Association nel 2011-2012. E quindi ci sono tante altre cose, tanti premi anche che ha ricevuto, ma noi siamo contenti, siamo felici di poterlo ascoltare questa sera. E lui ci parlerà dico il titolo, così come è formulato in maniera di domanda, What was Jesus doing at the wedding? Reflections on the Cana story. Lui mi ha promesso che parlerà un po' lentamente, in maniera che diciamo, il pubblico possa seguire bene il suo inglese, ma anche abbiamo il testo, quindi questo sempre è un grande aiuto. Allora, a lei la parola.
Tante grazie. È un onore e un piacere che sono stato invitato a partecipare a questa conferenza per onorare padre Alonso Schökel e per esplorare il tema del matrimonio nelle Scritture, soggetto a cui padre Schökel dedicava notevole tempo e energia. But I'm going to say my contributions in English, lest I grate you with my poor Italian. I make this contribution too as someone who, for the last 50 years, has been engaged in the sacrament of matrimony and has spent a good deal of time with local congregations preparing people for the sacrament of matrimony. So this is a subject of great interest to me. My contribution focuses on a passage that has played a significant role in the Church's reflection on marriage, namely the story in the fourth Gospel about Jesus' participation in the wedding feast of Cana. As the Catechism of the Catholic Church states, on the threshold of his public life, Jesus performs his first sign at his mother's request during a wedding feast. The Church attaches great importance to Jesus' presence at the wedding at Cana. She sees in it the confirmation of the goodness of marriage and the proclamation that thenceforth marriage will be an efficacious sign of Christ's presence. So far, the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Beyond its traditional role in sacramental theology, the episode has now found a new focus within the practice of Catholic prayer as one of the luminous mysteries of the Rosary. That mystery, in turn, celebrates the institution of the sacrament and the virtue of fidelity. While the pericope of the wedding feast has proven useful in sacramental theology and spirituality, exegetes and interpreters of the fourth gospel have spent a good deal of time and energy trying to make sense of this first sign, as it is labeled. The passage has many curious features that don't seem to relate directly to the image of matrimony. I'm going to show you some pictures as we go along here, in part, I think, responding to the efforts to think about the history of interpretation as part of the mission of the Biblicum. And one way in which biblical texts are interpreted is through visual means, and there's a lot of interpretation that's relevant to the topic today that you'll see on the screen. In any case, what you're seeing there is a painting by Tintoretto, Jacobo Cumin, otherwise known as Robusti. This dates from the middle of the 16th century. And it's a feast, all right, but is it a wedding? Where's the wedding in this picture, one might ask? All right, in any case, there are curious features to this story. There is Jesus' relationship with his mother, the stone jars that evoke halakhic concerns for purity, and the apparent superabundance of wine. Like the other numbered sign, there's only one other numbered sign, the healing of the royal official's son in John 4, but unlike most of the deeds that Jesus performs in the first half of the gospel, there is no extensive dialogue or discourse that suggests the meaning of this action. That absence has not prevented readers from finding symbolic significance in the story. The sign, which, as the text says, reveals the glory of Jesus, may simply manifest his power. And scholars who think that a collection of miracle stories underlies the fourth gospel find evidence for their hypothesis in such a construal. Yet in the context of this gospel, readers expect more. The sign is not simply a wonder, but it should point to something about the significance of Jesus. Yet that precise significance has been read in innumerable ways. As Barnabas Linders noted a half-century ago, the possibilities are endless. Perceived intertextual allusions, and we've heard a bit about intertextual allusions here today, perceived intertextual allusions play a large role in many readings of this sign. Some interpreters hear echoes of Old Testament images of marriage between God and Israel, which we've heard a good deal about today, such as Isaiah's proclamation in Isaiah 54 to Israel that your Maker is your husband, or Trito Isaiah's declaration that the land of Israel is now married, or similar proclamations in Hosea, such as the one featured on our program, as well as passages in Jeremiah, Joel, Zechariah, etc. Other interpreters who find allusions to the Hebrew Bible focus on the abundance of wine that Jesus produces. That abundance, as one scholar puts it, might present a problem for ascetics, yet it may evoke something significant. There are banquets in the Bible that are simply banquets, such as that of Ahasuerus in Esther. But at least one scholar has found that to be reflected in the miracle at Cana. Others think that the abundant wine recalls Isaiah's feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, or a similar glorious feast in that day by Joel, or a similar one by Amos. With these texts on the horizon, the wine at Cana may herald the dawn of the Messianic age. And here we see Veronese's version of the wedding feast at Cana. And if ever there was a Messianic banquet, there is one of them in an absolutely glorious setting, if you ask me. In any case, such a reading of the wedding feast as an eschatological sign raises the question of how this gospel frames eschatological hope. In its current canonical form, the gospel certainly holds in tension future expectation and the affirmation that such hope is at least partially realized in the relationship of the believer to Christ in the here and now, the wedding of the believer to God. In the story of John, the transformed wine is present, but only available to a select few. If the wine is a symbol of abundant life, Veronese's depiction offers a generous and comprehensive view of what that life is like. Some read the text as a comment on its social situation and hold that the story symbolizes the relationship between the Johannine community and its Jewish source, represented by Jesus' mother. The remark by Jesus, which some interpreters find to be abrupt, "Woman, what is it to you and me?" indicates for these readers the separation from the Johannine group's parent community. The creation of the abundant new wine indicates a new reality that Jesus brings only to the new fellowship. This reading maps the details of the story onto the presumed social setting of the gospel, which many 20th scholars, such as Louis Martin and Raymond Brown, have found productive for interpretation. Yet exactly what the point of mapping such a social division onto a marriage story might be is a little bit obscure. It might be more appropriate had there been a divorce after the marriage. Yet it is just as likely and more appropriate for the use of the story in some sacramental framework that the unnamed bride and groom live happily ever after. But the story just doesn't tell us. The role of Jesus' mother could, of course, be read in another way. And here we have an illustration from the 17th century Dutch artist Frans van Franken, who places Mary and the bride in the limelight, in the controlling elements of this picture. Right in the center of things, Jesus is almost an afterthought over on the side. A very different reading of the gender dynamics of this scene. In any case, the reference to Mary as woman might evoke another intertextual allusion, the creation story with Eve, the original woman. This reading would tie in with the temporal framework for this episode, on the third day, according to John 2:1. That temporal marker, when combined with the temporal references in the first chapter, yields a 7-day sequence. This seventh day, the wedding day, would then be a figurative Sabbath in which the divine bridegroom is revealed. Possible. Other interpretations of the Cana episode focus on the practices of the community that read the gospel, finding in the new wine an allusion to the passion of Christ and to the blood which Jesus says his disciples must drink in John 6:53. For these readers, the wedding feast is the first of a series of symbolic allusions to the ritual life of the church that is seen to pervade the gospel. If this story does embody an allusion to the Eucharist, and at the same time a subtle play on the symbol of marriage to refer to the relationship between Christ and the believer, then it might be possible to develop a notion of the Eucharist as a form of sacred marriage. But this is surely a prime example of a house built on fragilely stacked cards. This kind of reading, which the gospel has produced in great abundance, reminds me of a remark by one of my former colleagues at Yale, Wayne Meeks, who said, "One could argue that this gospel has won its secure place in the affections of generations of readers, and its profound influence on theological, literary, and moral sensibilities of Western culture only through an endless series of more or less strong misreadings," in the sense that the literary critic Harold Bloom uses for that term. So far, Wayne Meeks. If intertextual allusions play a role, so do intratextual gestures. Some hear in the transformation of water to wine echoes of the prologue and its Christological affirmation that the Word became flesh, or find in the transformation an anticipation of the transformation of death to life in Jesus' resurrection. In any case, the significant symbolic element of the story is the very act of transformation. This is a serious possibility, and I'm going to be coming back to it. But before focusing on it, we should review some more interpretative possibilities and think about why Jesus was at a wedding. The wondrous transformation of water to wine suggests to some interpreters an appeal to the Gospel's assumed religio-historical context, and more particularly to stories about the Greek god Dionysus, which involve various wine miracles. One such story tells of fountains of water that become fountains of wine on the god's feast day. Another tells of empty wine jars placed in a temple that become miraculously filled with wine, again on a special feast day. How close these are to what happens at Cana has been debated, but they are indeed significant wine miracles. Some readers find in such parallels an appeal to a cultural model that some Gentile readers might appreciate. Others find a competitive or polemical stance against a Dionysiac cult, which, as finds at Sepphoris and Beit Shan suggest, may have been present in the environment where the gospel might have originally developed. Yet Dionysiac imagery was widely used, and some interpreters suggest its allegorical significance is important. The Jewish philosophical exegete Philo knows that allegorical trope and applies Dionysiac imagery to the mysterious figure of Melchizedek. The wine, in any case, seems to be front and center in some interpretations, as it is in this relief from the 17th century Dutch church in the town where Hieronymus Bosch grew up. This brief review of interpretative options began with a reference to Barnabas Linders and his observation about the almost endless attempts to offer an interpretation of the Cana episode and explanations of why Jesus might have been there. Linders himself focused on the new dimension of the coming of Christ, rather than with a particular aspect of its meaning. For him, and for Rudolf Schnackenberg as well, the nucleus of the story is the saying in verse 10, "You have kept the good wine until now." The miracle simply points to the marvelous new thing that is now happening in the ministry of Jesus, whatever other associations one might want to make. Yes, something is afoot that is new, and the presence of Christ will be transformative in many ways throughout this gospel. In reflecting on that transformative process and that transformative presence, we might be able to say something a bit more relevant about the theme of marriage and perhaps answer the question of why Jesus was at this one. For all the symbolic indeterminacy, it's of interest that the setting of this transformation is a wedding. Other settings in the Gospel seem to have an evocative role to play, a role that contributes significantly to the meaning of those episodes. These settings include the well where Jesus meets the Samaritan woman, the pool of Bethzatha or Bethesda, where he cures a cripple, the pool of Siloam, where he sends the blind man, the garden where he's buried and where he encounters Mary Magdalene, to name the more obvious cases. What then might the significance of simply having a wedding be? In thinking about the setting, it's certainly useful to keep in mind famous weddings and nuptial imagery. And it's also worthwhile to recall the context of early Christian tradition about Jesus as represented in the Synoptic Gospels. I cannot here review the long debate about the relationship between John and the Synoptics, on which the scholarly house is still substantially divided. Let me simply state my position that our evangelist knows the Synoptics, as well as other traditions about Jesus, and our evangelist uses those synoptic traditions, but in a highly selective and deliberate way, to craft his own picture of Jesus. And sometimes that picture is in tension with what we find in the synoptics. One significant feature of traditions about Jesus in the synoptics, despite the fact that we have the image of Jesus as the spouse, is that Jesus is not particularly family-friendly. Jesus came to bring not peace, but a sword, he says. He came to divide a man from his father and a daughter from his mother. Matthew 10:34, Luke 12:51. Matthew Jesus warns potential disciples that they cannot love their family more than him. Matthew 10:37. And Luke's Jesus startles his readers by telling his disciples that they must hate their fathers, mothers, wives, and children. Luke 14:26. Although Jesus famously prohibited divorce, according to both the synoptics and Paul, his sayings are not always favorable to marriage. The radically disruptive voice of Jesus celebrates those who make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Whatever that means, it doesn't mean get married. Nothing of this sort, no negative saying on marriage or family, appears in the fourth gospel. Is that absence accidental? Attitudes toward marriage in the early Christian communities obviously varied considerably. Paul's community at Corinth clearly had issues connected with marriage. Some of Paul's followers, perhaps inspired by what Paul himself said, claimed that it was not appropriate for a man to touch a woman. 1 Corinthians 7:1. Paul himself apparently embraced celibacy and wished that all could be like him, if that's how to read 1 Corinthians 7:7. But Paul also affirmed the sacred character of marriage and lauded it, even when unbelievers were involved, as a means of sanctifying husband, wife, and children. Paul's affirmation of marriage continued in communities associated with him, resulting in various household codes that caused such consternation for modern sensibilities. Pauline communities were not alone, as the presence of similar household codes in 1 Peter attests. Yet the matter of marriage continued to be debated through the 2nd century and beyond. Many of the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles embraced the ideal of celibacy. In the Pauline tradition, the image of Thecla looms large. That woman disciple not only embraced celibacy, but also was something of a gender bender in her dress and her hairstyle. The tradition associated with the Apostle Thomas, in an even more radical fashion, apparently advocated syncretism, the embrace of voluntary chastity by all who would be truly followers of Christ. This stance obviously has important potential for the narrative logic of these 2nd century works, in which important women believers are alienated from their husbands or lovers by the gospel message, initiating a chain of events that eventually leads to martyrdom. The Acts of Thomas adds an interesting twist, which also involves the appearance of Jesus at a wedding, in this case, by appearing to a couple on their wedding night, where he convinces them to embrace celibacy. By contrast, the support by Jesus in the Cana episode of a bridal couple in need, or at least in danger of embarrassment, seems instead to indeed affirm the institution of marriage. One might read the comment by Jesus to his mother in John 2:4 as an oblique reference to the kind of portrait of Jesus sketched in the synoptics, the unfamily-friendly Jesus. Of what concern would it be to a Jesus who was critical of family ties to make a wedding banquet run smoothly? And of what concern would it be to his mother, who conceived her son without the usual practice of marital relations, to celebrate the inauguration of those relations? Yes, but as so often, mother knows best, and Jesus is here to celebrate those relations. Yes, the Cana story does offer an endorsement of marriage, and does so against the background of Christian controversies about the role of marriage in the life of the believing community. I think to see this story correctly, you have to see it within that context and see it taking a stand on what was a controversial issue by the end of the 1st century. Yet the Cana story works within a larger context of this gospel's handling of erotic and nuptial motifs. In this case, as in so many others, the fourth gospel develops the theme gradually and in a complex way. I have likened this technique to that of an arabesque, not the dance routine, but the artistic convention found in so many ancient mosaics, including, for instance, the nearby apse of San Clemente, where we find a vine weaving an intricate web around a central image. I'd like to explore here the marital strand of the fourth Gospel's arabesque. The first hint that the wedding of Cana has potential implications for marital symbolism is John the Baptist's remark in John 3:29 and 30, comparing Jesus to the groom and himself to the groom's friend. Perhaps an interpretation of the saying about sandals in John 1:11, paralleled in the synoptics about which we heard earlier, or the saying about Jesus being the groom in Matthew 9:16. But here it's on the lips of John, not connected with the baptism story. To understand the implications of this saying, it's important to keep in mind ancient Jewish customs surrounding the marriage ceremony. This is a very graphic image. This is a trigger warning. The groom, having the bride, ekon tein nymphein, is not simply holding her hand. He's in the bridal chamber on the wedding night. The friend of the groom who stands, hestekos, is not simply waiting at a ceremonial chuppah, but is standing outside the wedding chamber. The fact that he rejoices when he hears the groom's joy, akuonatu chara, is not a reference to the groom chatting or telling jokes, but to his delight at the marital act. In the fourth Gospel, John the Baptizer uses explicit marital imagery, explicit sexual imagery about Jesus and himself. The main point of the comparison is not to develop some allegorical symbolism, but to highlight his joy at hearing his master's voice. This confession puts the baptizer in his rightful place for the last time in the Gospel, as definitely subordinate to Jesus, but incidentally, it does paint Jesus as bridegroom and does so in a rather erotic way. The theme continues in several passages that will involve hints of sexual attraction between Jesus and various potential lovers and friends. These passages include the encounter of Jesus with the Samaritan woman in chapter 4, the vignettes of Jesus and the beloved disciple at the Last Supper in chapter 13, the encounter with Mary Magdalene in chapter 20. All of these stories involve in one way or another something erotic. Yet they also insist on the transformative power of encounter with Jesus, a power that transforms physical attraction to mission. In the case of the woman that Eastern tradition knows as Photina, the Samaritan, it is, as already noted, the setting of the scene that cues the erotic motifs. Some portrayals of the encounter of Jesus and the Samaritan woman don't particularly show anything erotic. The mosaic at Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna is pretty tame. But there was a statue outside of the office that I held at the University of Notre Dame for many years that has Jesus and the woman engaged in a conversation that looks very much like the kinds of conversation that took place between undergraduate men and women at the University of Notre Dame. In any case, the kind of place where Israel's patriarchs and its lawgiver found their significant others suggests something about the potential nuptial dimensions of the story. The interactions between Jesus and the Samaritan can be read in different ways, and it's interesting to trace the way visual artists have represented the scene, with more or less erotic or at least flirtatious touches involved. Here are three. Bernardo Strozzi, a young artist of the late Renaissance in the 16th century, died 1604. Not too erotic. Gets a little bit more spicy here. Carlo Marato in the 17th century. And there are many more like these that I could bring for you here, but I've only selected a few. And then there's this rather interesting one, getting out of the Italian orbit for a while and going to modern China, an artist, He Chi from Nanjing in the 20th century, that has Jesus reaching out and that hand would probably be slapped down in at least a modern American context. And the young lady appears here very much like what we would call a valley girl in the U.S., with a kind of ironic touch to her vision of Jesus. In any case, at the end of the day, the story of Jesus at the Samaritan well is about transformations of various sorts. Jesus, the requester of water, becomes its supplier. Jesus, the potential suitor, becomes the sought, as the Samaritan woman becomes more and more intrigued by this strangely insightful stranger. The woman who has had a life of sexual engagement with her 5 husbands, however she acquired them, now becomes the first tentative spokesperson for Jesus, long before his disciples engage in any evangelizing. In short, eros turns to agape and eventually to mission. Is this story of the Samaritan woman offering a qualification of some sort to the hint of the previous chapter that Jesus is a bridegroom? Jesus works in a way that differs dramatically from ordinary husbands. Like the idea of the beautiful in Diotima's speech in Plato's Symposium, or like Socrates in the final episode of that dialogue, which describes his relationship with the young Alcibiades, or like Aristotle's prime mover, which may have been inspired by Plato's dialogue, Jesus moves as an object of desire, kine hos erumenon, as Aristotle said. In all these cases of desired objects, the lover, for various reasons, cannot make a direct connection with the beloved. Neither can the readers, real or implied, of John's Gospel. They, or let's face it, we, can embrace this bridegroom indirectly through sacramental symbols, or, as in the Samaritan woman's case, by becoming an agent of his proclamation. The story of Photina is not the only place in the Gospel where erotic motifs are appropriated and reinterpreted, as scholars such as Stefan Telburg have argued. Jesus seems to have very positive relationships with other women in the Gospel, with Martha, whom he is said to love in 11:5, with her sister Mary, with whom Jesus shares a moment of intense emotion in Bethany as they weep at the tomb of Lazarus. The story of Jesus and the 2 women at Bethany does not end with the raising of Lazarus. That same Mary performs her intimate act of anointing, taking off sandals again, when Jesus comes to dinner at Bethany 6 days before Passover. Mary of Bethany's action, like so much else in this gospel, can be read in various ways. It could be an expression of thanks for the miracle of Lazarus restored to life. It could involve a hint of repentance for the superficial way in which both Mary and Martha had articulated a hope for eschatological resurrection in the face of the one who is, by his own testimony, resurrection and life in the here and now. After her action, in the face of opposition from his disciples, Jesus offers his own interpretation of Mary's deed. It was a preparation for his own death. In other words, love for this bridegroom and embrace of his life-giving presence cannot be divorced from embracing the significance of his death. The gospel signals that Mary of Bethany's action in anointing Jesus is bound up with the final events of his life. What forged the bond between anointing and death merits further reflection. One of the most striking things about the episode in John 12 is that Mary's deed anticipates the action of Jesus himself at the Last Supper. There, by adopting the role of a servant, Jesus physically demonstrates what he requires of his disciples. Mary of Bethany is an obedient disciple even before the Master has given his instructive example. Her action teaches that those who love the one who dispenses and himself is resurrection and life must embrace him in his act of self-giving service. If there's any resonance of the erotic in Mary's action, it's dramatically transformed. The relations of the bridegroom to those whom he loves do not end in Bethany. Jesus also relates to the other Mary, Mary Magdalene, who in mourning his resurrection he turns to joy. Yet each of these relationships soon yields to something other than intimacy between Jesus and a beloved one. Martha makes a confession, the full import of which she does not seem to understand in chapter 11, providing a teaching moment for Jesus. Mary of Bethany does her loving deed of anointing, but its major function is to serve as a sign, a pointer to the events of the Passion to come. And Mary Magdalene wants to have some kind of physical connection with Jesus, if only that of a gentle touch. But Jesus refuses her gesture and sends Mary on her way, like the Samaritan woman, to tell about him. Here are three versions of that scene, the famous Noli Me Tangere scene. First of all, Fra Angelico, the beginning of the Renaissance, where we have Jesus sort of gently walking away from Mary. Things get a little dicier as we move along. Il Correggio has Jesus saying, "Definitely don't touch me, I gotta go." Agnolo Bronzino in the 16th century gets a little more definite. "Please don't you dare be touching me," I think he's saying here. And then Titian has Jesus saying, in effect, "Ooh, please don't touch me." There's something about these paintings and the interpretation of the Noli Me Tangere scene that suggests that Mary is doing something wrong and that Jesus would be somehow defiled by his touch. Not everybody reads the Noli Me Tangere scene in precisely the same way. Rubens has a much more earthy rendition of the encounter between Jesus and Mary. They're not touching, but they might as well be. Rembrandt has a different focus, not on the moment of "don't touch me," but on the moment of recognition. And that might be an important way of reading this scene, when Mary hears the voice of Jesus calling her name and recognizes him as her Lord, in effect, her spouse, before she is sent on mission. It's knowledge, the knowledge that comes in that recognition, that sets her free from her grief. But not everybody has the separation between Jesus and Mary Magdalene in this episode. The sculpture on the bronze doors at the Duomo in Milan very much has Jesus and Mary Magdalene still touching. So in that case, you'd have to read the Noli Me Tangere as "stop touching me," which I don't think it is. But in any case, that gets at something. There's a connection being made here, whatever it is that Mary finally does. The bridegroom may abide with those whom he is taught to love, but that abiding takes the form of action in his image and on his behalf. And we see a connection between Jesus and Mary and all of these latter ones before she goes on to do her thing. Although it's not the kind of connection that things like the Da Vinci Code want to deposit, right? If the gospel works, getting back to some of our earlier accounts, if the gospel works in the encounter at Samaria to change the water of ordinary attraction to the wine of loving service, it suggests that the institution which marriage grounds, the family, is also to be transformed. This transformation is expressed through the depiction of the relationship between Jesus and his unnamed mother. Jesus' mother will appear again at the climactic final scene of his public ministry, the hour of his crucifixion and glorification, when she will stand at the foot of the cross. If marriage results in the creation of a family, so too does relationship with the gospel's one and only bridegroom. Yet the bridegroom's family does not look like an ordinary family. By committing his mother to the disciple whom he loved, he cares for her, but unfolds the private relationship of the family into that of the community of beloved disciples, which includes figures like the penitent Mary, here in this 15th century painting by Masaccio, here in her flowing red cloak at the foot of the cross. At the same time, Jesus redefines his relationship with that other beloved, a dear friend, who in effect becomes his brother. The disciple who had enjoyed special intimacy with Jesus at his Last Supper, evocative of the relationship of friends in classical symposia, with the eroticism that that friendship usually involved, is now much more than a friend. The dramatic little scene of Jesus, his mother, and the beloved disciple is the Johannine version of the widespread early Christian belief that the family, the children of God, has been created by an adoptive relationship wherein we all are brothers and sisters of God's Son. The bridegroom elicits his loving response from women and men alike and draws them into relationship with himself in a community of loving embrace. That community is formed first and foremost at the foot of the cross, where those who have eyes trained to see the truth see not simply a bloody body, but a paschal lamb, whose death inspires a life of service, a form of matrimony that binds but also liberates as only truth can do. In conclusion, let's return to our wedding at Cana. What was Jesus doing at such an event? This picture suggests a rather young Jesus taking center stage. I'm not sure that's quite right. It may be a young Jesus, all right, but taking center stage, no. And in so many of these paintings, he's taking center stage. The gospel story involves an elusive play on an old image of God as Israel's bridegroom. The story also introduces a complex thread of images revolving around tales of erotic or quasi-erotic attachment. That thread transforms those tales into an appeal to be united to the truth that the bridegroom teaches, the truth that God is love, and those who abide in loving service abide in God and God in them. In introducing this theme, the story strikes an ironic note. The lofty Messiah and Son of Man reveals himself and his glory subtly, not in the political or economic sphere, not in grand banquets, the like of which we saw at the beginning of our review of the painted witnesses to this event, but in the realm of domestic relations, not in the bidding of potentates, but in the confident request of a mother, not to remove the sins of the world, but to save a neighbor's face. The light ironies of the story hint at the paradox of glory in and through humiliation that will be at the heart of the truth that this gospel proclaims. This little version shows Jesus off to the side. There's a wedding going on, all right, so that's still part of the picture, but Jesus is not at the center of things. And this one, that last one, was by a 19th century Romantic artist. This by an Australian artist. Shows Jesus, likewise, not quite at the center of things, doing his act of service for those who are getting married. And the last version along these lines is by a 19th, early 20th century Russian realist, known primarily for his politically oriented realist art, but has one painting here of Jesus at the Cana event, and he's very much on the periphery of things, out with the servants, making sure the wine is going to flow. The ironies of the gospel's general strategy suggest something about the way in which it affirms marriage through Jesus' presence at Cana. In the world of Jesus' disciples, marriage has value as part of a larger context. Marriage, where glory is revealed in mundane, quotidian realities of adapting to the needs of a beloved other, expresses a commitment to another ironically glorious relationship. The bridegroom, with whom all of his followers abide in a union even deeper than marriage, calls them to a love unceasingly generous, a love divine, all loves excelling, but a love willing to take care of the wine supply. And that's why Jesus was at Cana. Thank you.